So welcome to the people of Higgins. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for what is a discussion about clean tech for our net zero future. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Alan Finkel, who is also a local constituent and has been doing such a lot of work in the last many years. I'm very grateful for him giving of his time to help us understand more about our clean tech future and what it means for Australians. So thank you very much, Dr. Finkel, for joining us. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we all Zoom meet and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be with us today. Welcome. So we have actually got a number of people who are coming online, so there's quite a big group of people joining us, but we've had so many questions that have been submitted, and I'm delighted that I'll be reading out questions from you, the constituents of Higgins, who are interested in what clean tech solutions that we've got and what it means with regards to engaging and getting our emissions down and how we're going to get there. And it's wonderful to actually have someone like Dr. Finkel join us because he has an extensive background as an engineer, as an entrepreneur, as an educator and a neuroscientist, and he was Australia's chief scientist from 2016 to 2020. He led the development in 2016 of the National Research Infrastructure Roadmap. In 2017, he led the review into the national electricity market, which is called the Finkel Review, and it's had an enormous impact on the framework of how Australia actually deals with its electricity market. In 2018, he led the STEM, which is the Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics Industry Partnership Forum report. And 2019, he led an incredibly important strategic review into a national hydrogen strategy, which we will hear about, I'm sure, this evening in his introductory comments. In October 2020, at the request of National Cabinet, Dr. Finkel led a review of the systems and operations in all states and territories for effective COVID testing, contact tracing and outbreak management. And to exchange case and outbreak management data between states and territories. And that was really incredible work that you did, Alan, into helping Australia work together across the different jurisdictions. I often say competitive federalism works well when it works with sharing of data. And I know, having spoken to you as a local constituent, about how important you were in making sure Australia had one of the best COVID responses in the world. So thank you for bringing your technological, entrepreneurial spirit and scientific brilliance to our COVID response. It's been a really welcomed contribution that you have made to ensuring that. But in December 2020, having stepped down as the chief scientist, he was actually then promoted to special advisor to the Australian government on low emissions technology. And I would say that will be your ongoing and most important role. I know you have many other interests. You are what I would regard as a true Renaissance man. You have an incredibly inquiring mind, great enthusiasm. But as a local constituent, as a brilliant scientist, and someone who really has made such a significant contribution to society in Australia and to our community at large, I'm very proud to have invited you to come and join us. And I think we'll have a really wonderful discussion this evening. So thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Katie, my pleasure, and thank you so much for that very warm introduction. Can I take a few minutes and just set some context before we do questions and answer?
Yes.
All right. Let me just start with recent times and with the statement, what a difference 3 weeks makes. On October the 26th, the government announced the net zero delivery plan, net zero by 2050 delivery plan. November the 2nd, the government in Glasgow announced the update to the low emission technology roadmap. That's the roadmap that I chair. On November the 9th, just last week, they announced the future fuels vehicle strategy, which is code language for electric vehicles strategy. And the day after, on November the 10th, I think it was Wednesday of last week, the Prime Minister announced a $1 billion clean tech venture capital fund. And then if you think about the last 2 weeks outside of Australia, we've had COP26 playing out. Of course, it came to conclusion last night, but along the way we had the Global Methane Pledge with 100 countries signing on, a declaration on ending deforestation, again with 100 countries. Most importantly, last night they finished with an agreement on new rules for robust trading rules for carbon markets, international carbon markets. That's something that's been a hangover since the Paris Agreement back in 2015. Then all year, so if you go on a longer time frame to all year, it's been a year where there's been intense pressure from Joe Biden and the Biden administration on all countries around the world. Intense pressure from Boris Johnson and his administration on all countries around the world. There's been the threat, and it's real, a real threat of carbon border adjustment mechanisms proposed by the European Union and seconded by the American government. We've had the code red alert from the United Nations IPCC. So the most recent report from this very august body that is clearly articulating the problems that we face from climate change. And then companies have faced pressures from shareholders and insurance companies and regulators and climate activists and their customers. You could say that other than that, everything's been easy. So let me elaborate a little bit on those really key advances of the last few weeks. So a few words on the plan to deliver net zero. It relies on clean technology to deliver the emissions reduction. So it's all about getting to zero. And in the main, it's about use of technology. Not in isolation, technology has to be financed. There's got to be policy. There's got to be community engagement and acceptance. It has to be sustainable markets, but it's technology that does deliver the emissions reductions. And most of those reductions in the overarching net zero plan will come from the low emissions technology roadmap, the one that I chair. But it also will come from agreements with the states and the territories to invest in transmission lines and other things, from business incentives, from the critical minerals strategy, and from bilateral country partnerships that I'll speak about in a moment too. When people ask me, what is going to do it for us? What is the single most important thing? I have to answer that the biggest return on effort will come from converting our existing electricity supply to be a zero emissions supply. In other words, using solar and wind and a little bit of hydro in electricity in Australia, nuclear in other countries. We have to convert our existing electricity supply for our computers and our lighting systems and our machines and air conditioning to zero emissions. And then we have to triple it. It's a huge job converting it, and then we've got to build it out a second and a third time so that we've got ample zero emissions electricity to run the electric cars of the future and the trucks and the trains, and to provide the building heat of the future and industrial heat, in all cases, zero emissions solutions. So very quickly, a few words on on the other things. So the low emissions technology roadmap that I chaired the panel, we identified 6 priority technologies. All of them have large abatement potential and significant economic impact. They are clean hydrogen, storage in the electricity system, ultra low cost solar. We're going to drive the cost of solar down to 1/3 of what it is today, and it's already low. Low emissions materials, in particular, zero emissions steel and zero emissions aluminium. And then we recognize, the government recognizes, everybody recognizes that you can't actually get to zero emissions. As long as you've got human activity, there will be some irreducible activities that generate emissions. And so we have to mop up what remains. And that involves geosequestration. That means storing underground carbon dioxide, and that's carbon capture and storage, CCS, it's critically important, and biosequestration. In the most recent incarnation that came out last week of the low emissions technology roadmap, we also identified the importance of providing support for electric vehicles, so battery recharging public stations and hydrogen refueling stations, and other things that I just won't go into at the moment. Talking about electric cars, the future fuel vehicle strategy is a $250 million commitment from the federal government to work with industry and with state governments to build a network of public charging and refueling stations to assist commercial fleets with back-to-base charging, and most importantly, to do some studies on how we can intelligently integrate electric vehicle charging into the grid, so that instead of overloading the distribution system, overloading the poles and wires, we actually utilize the existing poles and wires more intelligently. And if we do that, we will reduce the cost of electricity to everybody, not just a benefit to the car owners, but a benefit to all householders. The last one I wanted to mention in a little bit of detail is the Clean Tech Venture Capital Funds. Its purpose is to help startups, Australian startups, bring clean technology, clean tech as we call it, to the market quicker, to be internationally competitive. It's $1 billion fund, $500 million from the Australian government, $500 million from private investors, and it's intended to operate like a regular venture capital fund. It's intended to be profitable and provide a return to the government and the investors, but it's very specific in supporting Australian clean tech. One of the other things I've been doing this year, Katie Allen mentioned that I was appointed as a special advisor. That's in addition to chairing the Low Emissions Technology Roadmap. And that's in recognition that Australia can't achieve net zero alone. We need to collaborate with other countries. And I was asked to broker partnerships with other countries, and it's gone quite successfully during the year. And we now have clean tech partnerships with the United Kingdom, signed by the Prime Minister, with the UK, with Germany, with Japan, Singapore, and Korea. And these are funded partnerships. It's more than just words, it's an intention to deliver. Look, I got to ask the question, because I'm asked this question often, are these packages enough? So if you ask a research scientist, he or she will say no, not enough. But if you ask citizens worried about the pace of change and their role in the future, it's actually a lot to contemplate. In my opinion, what we've seen in the last few weeks constitutes a fantastic step forward on where Australia was just 2 years ago. We have a base on which to build, and we're already making progress. What we have is a package of solutions that are sensible, and more importantly, they're adaptive, so they'll modify and improve as we learn more going forward. So fabulous progress in recent years and recent weeks. Katie, I've had the pleasure of discussing low emissions technology approaches with you many times during the year. And I need to tell your constituents that I know that you share my vision on the importance of decarbonising our economy, but doing so in a way that will generate jobs and economic growth. This decade, we're going to see the massive expansion of new and emerging technologies. It'll be quite transformational. Now, that build out of new technologies represents huge opportunities for companies and investors who've got the vision and the financial capacity and the project management and experience, and with that will come the jobs and economic growth that we're looking for. We have a sober opportunity for clear-thinking politicians like you, Katie, to lead your communities to embrace the future. May the force be with you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. You know, thank you also for your contribution with things like the quarterly essay. I encourage people to go and have a look at that. He's written very extensively. Dr. Finkel's written it very extensively. You know, I think the people of Higgins know that in my first speech, to me, it was very important to frame that climate action is so central to the people of Higgins. We believe in climate action, but that we need to, I believe that we needed to reframe the debate, not just as an environmental imperative, but as an economic one. And I believe that is what has happened with this over the last 2 years. And it's an economic inevitability. And I've written a number of opinion pieces on that. So if anyone wants to go to my website to have a look at that, there is a lot that we need to do, and there is more that we can do. But what I was surprised about with the Prime Minister when I spoke to him about his visit to COP26, I was at the pub last week, and he was asked by one of our local constituents who was at the pub, Mount Erica, what was the thing that was most surprising to him. And he said that what was most surprising was the appetite of private investment in this space now. It wasn't there in Paris, and he said there's $100 trillion in the pipeline that was there at Glasgow. And I think you and I, both as being scientists, very much see this as an opportunity for Australia to grab with both hands. And we need to navigate how to get there, not just for the environmental future of this planet and for Australia's role in that, but also for our own economic prosperity. And I really congratulate the work that you've done on sticking with hydrogen, because it seems to be coming into its own. I'm hearing more and more about it. I know when I first heard about it 2.5 years ago, I was a little bit cynical about it when we had our coffee, and you said hydrogen's the way of the future. And it's interesting. I think the world is seeing this as the real opportunity. And I've certainly brought together an informal group of coalition or government backbenchers with ambassadors in Canberra, and we meet every couple of months to talk about clean tech trade opportunities. And we meet with the ambassadors that you just mentioned before, and they are very willing to have better engagements with government and with our industries in Australia. I think this is the opportunity that we need to grasp, and we need to make sure the government backs that in. So my first question actually goes to just explaining to people who are on the call this concept of the pie that is the emissions reduction pie. And in your quarterly essay, you give a very nice summary of the fact that it's not just about electricity. You say in your assessment here that the sector of electricity accounts for 34% of emissions, stationary energy is 20%, transportation is 18%, fugitive emissions, which is when you take out things from the ground, you get fugitive emissions is 10%, agriculture is 13%, industry 7%, waste 2%, and land use is minus 4%. So my understanding, speaking to other experts, is that people think electricity is the one that's had the most I suppose, technical intent invested in it. And so with solar, with wind, with, lots of renewables technology, obviously hydro, and particularly in other countries like Canada and New Zealand, which are highly dependent on hydro, and we need to pivot to that, in my view, in a big way. And Scenario Hydro 2.0 is that pivot. But people tell me the electricity sector is going to be the quickest to decarbonise, and that's why we need to make sure we've got transport in our crosshairs, because price parity is coming for electric vehicles probably around about 2024, 2025. So we need to make sure the infrastructure is ready and willing, and we need the consumers to get behind transportation. But I was wondering if you could start by talking about just overall where you think the transportation sector is, not just for EVs, for inner cities, but for the long haul and heavy duty freight transportation capabilities, and how we're going to decarbonise the transportation sector.
Okay, so Katie, sort of perhaps making the answer a little bit longer to pick up some of the other things you were talking about. Electricity, as you said, is 34% of our existing emissions, and we're on a roll. People should be pretty excited by what's happening in Australia. I mean, we're starting off a pretty poor base in terms of emissions, because we've traditionally had a coal-fired electricity-intensive system.
Well, it was 85% just a few years ago. I think it's now
down to about 60%,
but still big.
Yeah. And what's happened in other countries like America and the UK, they've substantially gotten out of coal. In the UK, that's virtually gone. And in America, it's substantially reduced. But they've done it by substituting natural gas. They're generating as much electricity as they ever got from coal, or nearly as much, through the use of gas. And that is an improvement. Gas is significantly better than coal in terms of emissions, but it still has quite a high emissions profile. We're bypassing that step. We're on a pathway where we're going to replace coal with solar and wind. I wish that we were replacing with hydroelectricity as well, because that's such a well-behaved electricity source, but we haven't built a new catchment, big, large-scale hydroelectric dam for 50 years in Australia. So it's all about solar and wind electricity. And we're going direct from coal to that. There's still a role for natural gas, because solar and wind, you don't have them all the time. They're electrically not that well-behaved, and gas can support them. But we're not looking at gas to replace coal. We're looking at gas to support the solar and wind. And we can do it. And we're at a world-leading status. So in Australia, if you look at it per capita, so per person, we have more solar generation per person in Australia than any country in the world. It's remarkable. And our solar and wind generation is getting up to about 30% in the most recent quarter of our total generation. And we can keep that going. It's not easy. We need batteries, short duration storage, long duration storage. We need transmission lines. It's happening. There's a lot of planning going on for that. So let's assume that we can do it, and we've got an abundant zero emissions electricity supply. That takes us to the big sector called transport that you asked me about. It's changing so rapidly. The first electric car was on the roads in America in about 1890, and in the year 1900. In the year 1900, 40% of the cars in America were electric cars. Then they discovered oil, and by 1910, none of the cars on the road were electric cars. But because they didn't, the batteries didn't have the sort of performance that we're getting from modern lithium-ion batteries. But there's been this incredible resurgence, and the performance is just superb. And so around the world, people and governments have an interest, and car manufacturers see it's the place to be. And so up until a couple of weeks ago, I would have said 9 out of 10 of the large car manufacturers are committed to really converting their manufacturing by 2035, 2040 at the latest, to be only electricity. They will stop petrol cars. They will stop diesel cars. It will be yesterday's technology. The 10th was Toyota. They've had a commitment to hybrid vehicles, but they've now announced that they're making it so that everybody sees it, and Australians see it as well. We're been slow on the uptake partly because, well, a lot of reasons. One of the reasons, we're a big continent, and so people have genuinely been concerned about range. And when I first got involved in electric cars, I was part of the electric car charging industry in 2010. The cars that were coming out had 150 kilometres range. But now the standard cars have at least 300, many of them have 400, some of them have 500 kilometres range. And the charging facilities have gotten better and better. And if you're charging at home, it doesn't matter how long it takes, but infrequently when you're doing a long distance drive, if you go to a public charging station, you can top up your car in 45 minutes while you have a meal and get on your road. So as you said, Katie, the price point or the crossover for when the cost of ownership of an electric car, same size, comparable fit out compared to a petrol car, where the total cost of ownership of the electric car will be cheaper, is only 2 or 3 years away in Europe and America, and it'll be a couple of years later here. That's a total cost of ownership, acknowledging that the sticker price, the purchase price might be a bit higher, but your running costs are very much lower. It's only about 40% of the cost per kilometre to pay for electricity compared to petrol.
And also running costs. I mean, I have an
service costs ridiculously low. You've got a Tesla, haven't you?
When you drive it, actually, I mean, not only has it got fantastic acceleration, but you don't use your brake because it's got regenerative braking. It's like a Dodgem car where you put your foot on the pedal and you lift it up. It's a very different way of driving a car, actually.
That's an important point, because part of the reason some people are buying electric cars because they want to do the right thing for the environment. And some people are driving electric cars because it's just a much better driving experience. I've been driving an electric car for 8 years now, and I wouldn't want to go back into a petrol car.
Yeah. But it's worth pointing out with electric vehicles, you can, I mean, when we bought ours first home, we have 3-phase power, so we could just plug it in. But I am, for the people of Higgins, fighting for more electric vehicles, charging stations, super charging stations at places like swimming pools or libraries or places, sports facilities, you know, the Murrumbina Hug or Carnegie Pool or Malvern Town Hall, where people are parking their cars. So we're fighting for some electric vehicles, public charging stations to come to Higgins, because with Higgins, people are very keen to use new technology, but often they live in high rises. So we need to be able to make sure it's easy.
If you don't have your own off-street parking, it's a problem. Yeah. You need those public charges. So the new future vehicle, it's called Future Fuels vehicle strategy, but it's really about electric vehicles at the 90% level. And the details haven't been worked out yet, but there will be calls for expressions of interest, and they will map out the optimum locations. And there will be thousands of public charging, quick charging stations built over the next few years as a result of this $250 million commitment.
Yeah. And so then the other one's hydrogen, of course, and you took me for a drive in your hydrogen car. I have to say, I cannot believe it was just a few months ago and we were talking about hydrogen and you said, oh, I've ordered one. I said, they have hydrogen cars already? I just could not believe it. And then you said, yeah, there's an Altona charging station where you just fill. I'm like, how do you fill up a hydrogen car? And you said, oh, there's solar panels and they electrolyze, you know, water, crack it open with electrolysis and make hydrogen. Then you freeze it, compress it and freeze it and then fill your car. And it's an electric vehicle that's actually fueled by hydrogen. So it's like an electric vehicle, but it's got hydrogen as the fuel. And then I presume it just makes, as a fuel cell, it just makes water emissions. Is that correct?
Yeah,
so it farts water.
Yes, it's worth explaining to people. A lot of people, when they hear about the concept of a hydrogen power car, quite reasonably think, well, the hydrogen will go into an internal combustion engine, just like...
Which by the way, you can do.
You can do. You absolutely can do. But in reality, that's less efficient. You will drive fewer kilometres because an internal combustion engine is not as efficient as a fuel cell and electric motor. And also you've then got the complexity of an internal combustion engine. You have to have a clutch and you have to have gears. So what actually is done is they use the hydrogen to store energy as the chemical energy in the hydrogen. Then in a gadget that you mentioned called a fuel cell, they convert hydrogen plus oxygen from the air back into electricity to drive an electric motor. And that means just like a battery electric car, you don't need a clutch. You don't need a gearbox, you're changing gears. You get instant acceleration because an electric motor has maximum twisting power at 0 revs per minute. So it's a very pleasant driving experience, whether it's a hydrogen electric car or a battery electric car. The disadvantage of a hydrogen electric car is actually its advantage as well. So the disadvantage compared to a battery is you can't charge it at home. It's so convenient with a battery electric vehicle just to charge at home if you've got off-street parking.
Yeah. And with the hydrogen, it just takes what, sort of
Well,
5
with the hydrogen one, you have to go to a public hydrogen petrol station equivalent. We call it a hydrogen refueling station. And you go there, swipe your card, and you fill up in 3 minutes. And you're on your way. Trouble is, it's a chicken and egg situation at the moment. So there's only 5 hydrogen cars in Victoria, and I've privileged to have one. And there's only one refueling station, that's in Altona. So I have to drive about 18 kilometres to get it filled.
But you're a typical early uptake user. You'll take some of the inconveniences for the thrill of being one of the first.
Absolutely.
But the one thing about them is that they can, because it's 1 kilogram of hydrogen gets you 100 kilometres, and they can take 5 or 6 kilograms, and so that gets you 500 or 600 kilometres. So they're better for long range driving, which is good for freight and heavy duty vehicles for across our wide great continent. Is that right? And so they're more like
that's right. And also you've got there's no equivalent to battery degradation. They just keep working forever. They don't lose any power. But for a passenger car, a battery-powered vehicle is at least as good as a hydrogen vehicle, and you've got the convenience of charging at home. But when you're looking at big vehicles, long-distance, heavy haul, like a truck that's going to carry a 40-foot container from here to Brisbane, the battery load that you would have to carry in order to power that trip would be so heavy and so voluminous that you wouldn't have much freight room. Whereas hydrogen is a higher density transportable fuel than batteries. So it's a little bit like today, in the main, you use diesel for big trucks and trains and petrol for cars. In future, we think you'll be using hydrogen for big trucks and trains and batteries for cars.
So that sort of covers off on 3 questions. Bruce from Ashburton asked about hydrogen fuel cell technology and for long distance, and Mark from Murrumbeena asked about how far away is it as a mainstream energy source. So it's coming at speed. Obviously, there's lots of different colours of hydrogen. There's blue, which is, we don't want blue, we want green hydrogen, but then there's pink hydrogen in other countries and purple hydrogen. There's lots of different types of hydrogen. But obviously, we're talking today really about enabling green hydrogen to become commercialisable and scalable. So that takes us to the other parts of decarbonising, not just in transportation, but particularly manufacturing. So green aluminium, green cement and green steel. Now, I understand that Germany had a demonstration project of actually reducing and producing green steel and from iron ore, reducing it using renewables. But that's extremely inefficient and highly expensive. But the fact that they were able to produce green steel as a demonstration project is pretty exciting for a technologist and a scientist. And again, it's how to get it to a commercialisable, scalable issue. And is it like to do with hydrogen? It's all to do with the sort of the cost and the translation from a commercialisable, scalable point of view?
Yeah, the cost is the big challenge at the moment. The approach is well understood, but it's early days. And if you'd talked about solar electricity, which today is the cheapest form of electricity, if you'd had a discussion with me in the year 2000, I would have said, Katie, don't even think about it. It's way too expensive.
Or mobile phones, same thing.
Mobile phones too. And yet we've seen them just come down and down and down the cost curve. It's been remarkable. So driven by volume, driven in the early days by government subsidies and government support, but now driven by market demand, we've seen solar and wind and lithium ion batteries just outperform all predictions. What will happen with steel is there's going to be, there is growing government interest in converting it, because steel is a huge problem. If you just carbon dioxide, globally, steel making is responsible for 9% of carbon dioxide emissions, 7% of total greenhouse gas emissions. It's huge. And the way forward is to replace the coal in the blast furnace with a combination of renewable electricity for heat and hydrogen to do the chemical work that the carbon in coal does. So the carbon in a blast furnace, the coal, does two things. It provides heat, but it's also a chemical to convert the iron oxide into pure iron. And hydrogen will do that chemical step. And instead of getting carbon dioxide as a byproduct, you get H2O, you get water vapor as the byproduct. But at the moment, it's expensive. The hydrogen is much more expensive than the coal, and everything's got to be rebuilt. But you're right. Certainly the one I'm familiar with was an Austrian company that's made some green steel, and they sold it to Volvo. And Volvo is evaluating it to make sure it's got all the normal properties, which we think it will have. And they will start selling cars that are made from green steel for a price premium, because there are people, early adopters, who would just love to be able to buy an electric Volvo with green steel, you know, with a minimum footprint. And then early adopters like Volvo will build up the volume, which will enable the manufacturers to reduce their costs, and everything just gets better and better and better. You need huge volume to get to the same price parity or the price point of the existing incumbents.
So following on from that, I mean, with hydrogen and the cost, so when I said, you know, a kilogram gets you 100 kilometres, I test drove hydrogen refuelling out at the ACT, and they said they're using, you know, green energy off the grid, so this is a green product. And they said, we're making about 24 kilograms a day, which seems, you know, they need to be able to make more. But the issue is the cost. And I know you're the H2H2, which is H2 under $2 a kilogram. That's the aim to get to. But at the moment, you know, is it somewhere between $50 and $100 a kilo? I think it's pretty hard to work out how much it costs, but it's extremely expensive at the moment, isn't it? And that's the rate limiting factor. Is it the electrolyzers, the Frankenstein zapping of the water to crack it into H2 that is the issue? Is that the issue?
Well, there are two things that contribute to the cost. One is the cost of the electricity, and that's getting lower and lower and lower. And especially if you're doing it at a remote location where you're just generating your own solar and going straight into the electrolyzer, the gadget that makes the hydrogen, you get very low cost electricity. But the electrolyzers today are very expensive because the volume being manufactured and installed is just tiny compared to what we will ultimately need. So it's early days. But Bloomberg New Energy Finance and McKinsey, all the big analysts who have been looking into this, say that done today at scale, hydrogen would be about $6. Green hydrogen would be about $5 or $6 a kilogram, and it's quite likely that by 2030 we'll get it down to about $2 a kilogram. And at that point, hydrogen is competitive with petrol, competitive with gas in certain applications. To make hydrogen competitive with natural gas for big industrial applications and building heating and everything else like that, it has to get down to about $1.30 or $1.40 Australian, and people can see that as a plausible price target.
So getting back to the questions that we've got here, Stephanie from Carnegie asks, which Australian companies do you see as the lead innovators in clean energy technology development? Could you provide a few real-world examples of how existing companies are creating a path towards net zero emissions and how the government will assist them to make it a reality?
Well, the most prominent at the moment is Fortescue. Andrew Forrest has taken a very public stance. He's created a new company called FFI, Fortescue Future Industries, which is a wholly owned subsidiary. They may or may not separately float it off, I don't know. And they're taking 10% of their income after tax and applying it to Fortescue Future Industries. And their goal is to produce enormous quantities of green hydrogen for sale, but they will be their own first customer. They want to use the green hydrogen on their mine sites because their customers buying iron ore are saying, gosh, in future we want to make green steel, but there's no point us investing in replacing our blast furnaces if the iron ore that we buy use hundreds of thousands of litres or millions of litres of diesel fuel to run the machines to extract the iron ore. So Fortescue is trying to decarbonise the end-to-end supply chain and at the same time saying, we may as well make green hydrogen for other people as well. So they're very, very prominent. But some of the oil majors and gas majors like Santos and Woodside also see the opportunity to make hydrogen from natural gas with carbon capture and storage in the short term, and maybe the medium term, maybe even the long term, as long as they can do it really, really well and virtually eliminate the carbon dioxide emissions that would otherwise be the byproduct. But what's very exciting in Australia is we have some startups that are doing novel things. There's a little company, or little, just started, but it's growing very quickly, out of Newcastle in New South Wales, called Lavo, L-A-V-O, that is literally making a hydrogen battery. It's got about 3 times the capacity of a Tesla Powerwall. And instead of storing electrical energy off your solar panels in batteries, it stores it in hydrogen. So it makes the hydrogen and then converts the hydrogen back to electricity seamlessly in a box. And when they launched in May, they got, I think, about 4,000 or 5,000 orders internationally as well as from Australia, orders where people put a deposit on. So they're real orders. The excitement of this around this Australian technology is stunning.
Ah, fantastic. So I have a question here about Piera from Melbourne East asks, how is the grid going to cope with this new technology, wind and solar? Families have been without power for over 1 week since the last storm. So this was actually given to us last week. But it is a relevant point, particularly, I mean, I'm plugging in my EV and I feel like it's a bit like the NBN. If we all come home and plug in our car, I mean, I walk to work, but, you know, people come home and plug in their car. Just by the way, we try and plug it in on the weekend when it's sunny, so it's getting cheap energy during the day. But of course, when you're going to work, you can't necessarily do that. So how's the grid going to cope? And I know the Future Fuels strategy was talking about making sure there's going to be some grid reliability aspects. Do you know much about how we can make sure that happens?
Well, there's quite a few different concepts that you've woven into that, Katie. So in terms of how will the grid cope with the transition to zero emissions generation, solar and wind, it's really hard. So the national electricity market, which covers 85% of the population of Australia, the East Coast and South Australia, it's managed by an entity called AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, and they are constantly improving the software that they use and the processes they use to manage the grid, because it's so different. Solar and wind doesn't switch on demand, and now we've got people in their homes. So we now have 3 million small-scale generators connected to the national electricity market.
It's little green capitalists.
It's extraordinary. And then we've got the ability to shift loads and flexibly deal with them. And AEMO is world leading. AEMO in Australia and the California grid operator, New York grid operator, and the Irish grid operator in the UK. They're probably the 4 or 5 leading operators dealing with solar and wind variable electricity. So because they're so focused, they know what they're doing, I'm confident they'll cope. So that's how we'll cope with solar and wind. The problem after the storms is a completely different problem. It doesn't matter where the electricity is coming from, whether it's coming from coal-fired generators or solar and wind. Storms pull down transmission lines, and when you've got a doozy of a storm like we had, and trees are falling on the cables, it just takes time for the emergency services and the transmission companies and the distribution companies to fix it. So we're used to that. It happens rarely, but every few years it will happen. But now we've got this compounding problem. But gosh, if you're in an affected location, a suburb where the power's out for a week and you drive an electric car, what are you going to do? Well, that's a complicated problem that I'm not sure that it's been totally thought through. If you happen to have solar panels, then you've still got a local source of electricity. But if you don't have solar panels, then you better get into your car before it runs out and drive to some place that has still got electricity and plug into a public charger. Don't forget that with the range of cars at the moment, most people, and going forward, most people will only plug in and charge their car every 4 or 5 days, or maybe once a week. So if the grid goes down for a day or two, which would be extraordinary, it's very unusual, you'll probably cope just fine.
Yeah.
So you will need a little bit of planning if it's a big storm.
Yeah, I mean, I only charge mine once a week, or not even that, every 10 days, because I walk to work mostly. But so what about though the the surge of people coming in and plugging in their machines, kind of, and that sort of smoothing of the network? And like, I know there's, I mean, I'm Minister for energy emissions reduction, Angus Taylor came to visit Higgins, and I introduced him to a whole lot of different companies, and we've got a lot of great, clean tech companies that are emerging, sprouting like sunflowers, I like to say, in Higgins. Some of them are things like smart switches, which is just up the road in Malvern Road, which is about making sure that your energy is not being discharged from your computer while you've got a plug in, having a smart switch. Then there's, of course, smart houses. So people are turning on and off their appliances at different times of the day so they can make use of their solar panels at some times and not at others. But then there's also sort of smart metering, which means that AEMO can know which houses are using how much energy and understand that interaction so that we can kind of micromanage the grid in that way. So, that's going to be obviously a combination of AEMO/government and private, individuals wanting to engage in managing their own, sort of energy market, I suppose, because we can all be little green capitalists if we've all got solar panels and the ability to generate energy. So that's sort of, there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes about that, isn't there?
There's a lot of thinking, a little bit of work that's actually taken place. First of all, let me dismiss the nightmare scenario. It used to be that people thought, gosh, once everybody's got an electric car, they'll come home on a hot day, they'll all get home from work at about 6 o'clock, plug in, same time, go inside, open the fridge, grab a beer, turn on their flat screen TV, and the system will go down.
Yeah.
But that's in the days, that goes back 10 years, that thinking, when cars didn't have much range and people might have plugged in every day. But now with the much larger range, people will plug in once a week. So there's a randomization as to which day of the week you'll plug in. And then you won't plug in when you get home, you'll plug in when you've wrapped up for the day. If you're going out for dinner, you'll plug in at 10 o'clock when you come home. So the nightmare scenario doesn't exist, but still we want to do better than that. And ideally, we want to flexibly move the charging from, say, 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, where people are running their air conditioning, but there's no solar, to the afternoons, as you mentioned a little while ago. And part of the funding in the Future Fuels Vehicle Strategy of 4 major programs that it's doing, one of those 4 is to look at how we can operate a smart charging system and how you can incentivize people to cooperate, because the default position is to not plug in until you want to charge on Friday night because you want to go for a long drive on Saturday morning. That's the default position. But if you want to intelligently move the loads to when you can most efficiently use solar rooftop electricity and the poles and wires, you've got to incentivize people to leave their car plugged in for 24 hours when they're not driving at all, just when they came, during the day at work. And we don't really know the behavioural characteristics of people because there's not a lot of money involved. It's not that expensive to run an electric car, but people have a public good aspect to them. And so if there's a bit of incentive and an explanation of what the public good is, maybe it'll work. So we have to do the trials to see what can be done.
Excellent. So just moving to other parts of new technology, we've talked a lot about solar and wind, and obviously that's great for electricity sector. But people talk about, as you mentioned before, firming power, which or peaking power, which gas may provide in hopefully the very short term. But then battery technology or hydrogen or even new nuclear are the 3 kinds of firming power that people are using in other countries. Obviously, hydro's another one, and Snowy Hydro 2.0 has got a few more years before it comes online. And I know that's a big component of New Zealand and Canada's firming power. But with battery technology, I went to visit ARENA in Canberra and was looking at the bi-directional battery technology, the capability for our cars to become virtual power plants or battery storages, so that you can charge up your car from your solar and then you can use your car in theory to then charge up your house. And there's a lot of innovation in batteries. So I was wondering if you could make a comment about, batteries are not there yet because they only last for a certain period of time. There's no city I know that has a battery big enough to power it overnight when the sun's gone down and the wind's not blowing. So would you like to make a comment about where you think batteries are going? The cost obviously has to come down, the size has to come down. Is there new technologies, or are they going to be lithium-based for the foreseeable future?
So I think it's worth thinking about storage over short durations and long durations. So up to about 6 or 8 hours, which you are going to need every day once we're in a solar and wind powered electricity system. Lithium ion batteries are just fantastic, and there's no obvious contender. they're so ubiquitous because they're so capable, and the same battery chemistry is used in your mobile phones and your computer, your laptop computers and your tablets, as in cars and now in the grids. And so the manufacturers are getting the benefit of developing their expertise across 4 big markets, and it just gets better and better and better and better. There are other battery technologies, but lithium-ion is so well entrenched, it's difficult to see how the other ones will push them out in that short duration, 4, 5, 6 hour market. But when you're looking at long durations, there are other battery technologies such as flow batteries. We've got an Australian company called Redflow, does a sodium bromide flow battery. I can't go into the details, but they can in principle have longer and longer duration for not that much extra cost. But for long durations, really pumped hydroelectricity like the Snowy 2.0 or some of the capabilities coming out of Tasmania. Don't forget, Tasmania is, if you thought of Tasmania as a country, you'd say, well, that's a country that's virtually on zero emissions electricity. Yep. It's 99% or 100%. So pumped hydro is really important, but also hydrogen will be important because you can produce hydrogen with excess electricity. And otherwise, it will get wasted. When the sun's really bright and people aren't using much, you've got more electricity than you can use. If you use that to make hydrogen, as long as you've got a massive storage capability, you can then run that hydrogen into big fuel cells or big turbine generators and provide 10 days worth of electricity generation if you really need it. So hydrogen storage is at the long duration end, lithium ion at the short duration end, and then there's other things in the middle range. Small pumped hydro might be 24 hours, flow batteries might be 24 hours. We need everything. And then you can't just rely on batteries. You need transmission lines to bring the sun from where it's shining to where you need it, etc.
I sat next to someone at a dinner who was the owner of a lithium mine, and he said Australia exports about 90,000 tonnes of lithium at the moment, and at 14,000 tonnes, I hope I've got this data right, he said that's a couple of $1 billion industry. But he said we're anticipating, because of the growth in batteries, particularly EVs, and every EV has about 9 kilograms of lithium and about 40 kilograms of nickel. So these are critical minerals that are going to fuel the future technologies of the world. And he said that we are anticipating in Australia that it'll go from 90,000 tonnes being exported in 2021 to 2 million tonnes exported in 2030. So you can see the critical minerals that Australia is sitting on. There's some resources that we can pivot to using our mining skills. And if we can also refine lithium and get more value add from those products.
Yeah, the Australian miners are very innovative. If you went back 10, 12 years, say to 2010, Australia was a bit player in lithium exports. Now we are the largest lithium exporter in the world. But we don't take that innovation to the next level of adding value, of converting the lithium salts into the lithium chemicals that the battery manufacturers need, or the batteries themselves. That's the really big challenge, because that's where most of the money is.
Well, I've got 3 more quick questions and I'm hoping to fit them in. The first one is ultra low cost solar. So I noticed in the new plan that there's some excitement around new technologies and ultra low cost solar. Can you explain what new technologies made solar even,
Yeah, so the reason for having that as a priority is we realise that we need really cheap electricity for the hydrogen priority, for the zero emissions steel and aluminium priorities. It's critically important. Plus, cheap electricity will benefit everybody, households, industries, etc. Working with ARENA has put out a program called 30-30-30. They want to be a part of, it's an international effort, but a part of increasing the efficiency of solar panels from about 22% today to 30% by 2030, and for the installed cost at the solar farm of solar to be 30 cents. So 30-30-30, 30% efficiency, 30 cents per watt by 2030. And that's an ARENA program, and they've started the expressions of interest. And we see it as a stretch goal, which means it's hard to do, but we think we can do it. So that's the logic of that.
Well, I'm actually really proud that we've had 5 stretched goals, and I know you've led them, which is, hydrogen under $2 a kilogram, and carbon soil under $3 a hectare, and solar and batteries and green and cement and aluminium and carbon capture and storage. But they're about commercialising these technologies, not just wishful thinking about how we get there, how to make them commercializable and scalable, because we need to be able to use them as consumers. Otherwise, we're not going to decarbonise. So
No, that's right. And if anybody has the time to read the roadmap that was published 2 weeks ago in Glasgow, it's called the 2021 update. You'll actually find that there's a real analysis of the pathway, how we might get there by the timetable of 2030, 2035 for some of them.
Yeah.
It's a real,
and it's a bit like COVID with the vaccines. You don't know which technology is going to win. So that brings me to this question from Nafti from Kuyong asked, why is Australia not visiting the ban on the use of new nuclear? It offers significant advantages such as decarbonising the economy while providing reliable power. The technology is well established, not intermittent like wind or solar. It's not unproven like green hydrogen, though we'd have to argue that that's no longer the case, or reliable at scale, like battery storage. So there you go. I know it's very controversial, but I thought
very controversial, and you've got to look at two different ways. You can look at it purely from what it delivers in terms of emissions and electrical performance. And then you've got to balance that with social acceptability or community acceptability and costs. So if you're just looking at emissions, nuclear is perfect. It's zero emissions in operation, and the embedded carbon for manufacturing a certain capability of nuclear is probably less than the equivalent for solar and wind. So from an emissions point of view, nuclear is fantastic. From an electrical operations point of view, it's much better behaved than solar and wind. Solar and wind are wonderful, they're inexpensive, they're really cheap now, and there's zero emissions in operation, but electrically they're badly behaved. You can't tell them when you want them, they don't have characteristics that I can't explain at the moment, but electrical engineers look for synchronous operation, inertia, and system strength. They don't have any of them, and nuclear's got them all. So from emissions and performance point of view, nuclear is excellent. But you have to deal with community acceptance, and it's not there in Australia. I know that there's a shifting level of interest, but it's not there yet. And it's complicated because people have various fears when it comes to nuclear, even though on the numbers, the nuclear electricity industry has a safer history in terms of deaths per unit of electricity than everything other than wind, even better than solar. I won't go into it, but it's really quite impressive. But it's not, people are not comfortable with it. And you've also got to manage waste, deal with waste management. But the other con, if you like, is cost. So big nuclear stations, given the licensing requirements to meet the environmental requirements and the safety requirements, the big nuclear stations, they're not cost effective. But there's a new trend towards what's called small modular reactor. Now, a small modular reactor, Katie, it's not small in the sense that you and I might think. We're talking 300 tonnes. But they're small enough to be made in a factory and sent on a flatbed truck that occupies 2 lanes of the freeway with flashing yellow lights that a police escort from where it's made to where it can be used. And the beauty of that is they only need to go through the complicated licensing requirement once for the design, and then you can make it under factory conditions much more inexpensively. It's cheaper to make, and the quality control is superb. So if there's going to be a future for nuclear, it will be, in my opinion, small modular reactors, but it's a difficult discussion that you and your colleagues are going to have to lead, Katie, not me. It's a discussion that political leaders have to take to the community.
Well, I think on the pathway to 2050, we don't want to have one arm tied behind our back, and we need to be open to technologies. I don't think we're there yet in Australia, but I'm watching closely overseas, and let's see how those small modular reactors like NuScale in Utah are going with their demonstration projects. And let's see, because they're going to be some difficult to abate areas, and there's going to be some areas that if we really do want to get to a carbon neutral future, we're going to have to engage.
It would be nice to have a diversity of supply sources. We are looking at a future where we only have 2, solar and wind. Yeah. We're walking away from 3 really big ones, oil, coal and gas. And there's plenty of sunshine and plenty of wind, but it's sort of scary when you have 2 sources.
Yeah. Well, I looked at the, if you look at Our World in Data, it's really interesting to look at the mix of different countries. And, most of them have either a huge amount of hydro or nuclear and gas. And we have got a very big dependence on coal. So we need to get off coal and we need to do that using new energy transitions. So that's what I'm excited about. But we also need to look at the options as well, because I think it's going to be difficult to get, as you say, the last 15%, as your essay says, that's going to be hard. So that gets me to the last question, which is about personal responsibility. And you know, I know that people talk about, particularly, you know, eating red meat, and if we, you know, if they're going to be difficult to abate because, you know, that ruminants produce methane. It is worth pointing out to those on the call that Australia is one of the few countries that reports on every greenhouse gas in every sector every quarter. So we are very responsible with the way that we are measuring what we do, and we know what we're doing. So there's a lot of good stuff that we're doing. Apparently, we've got world-leading accounting capability that the world, you know, actually looks to our scientists with regards to accounting greenhouse gases, which is something to at least celebrate. So the last question goes down to, from Helen from Armidale, as an individual living in Armidale, what is the one best personal action? And I know, Alan, that you'll have several, so I'll let you have several. And community action I can take right now to make the biggest possible impact in reducing emissions.
So look, the simplest things you can do are your own behavioural patterns. You can become a vegan instead of a meat eater. You can be very conscientious on your waste management. You can avoid driving a car and ride a bike or take public transport, all of those things. But what you'll do is reduce your personal profile. But as a consumer, you can amplify your impact by your buying choices, because companies respond to the consumer input. And so if you can afford to pay a little bit extra to buy green electricity offsets, if you're buying a new car and you can afford it, buy a electric car. If you're buying shares, buy shares in companies that are themselves investing in electric vehicles and trucks, themselves exhibiting best practice. But be careful, don't do things that sound good but aren't. For example, there's a lot of shareholder pressure on companies like Exxon in America and Shell in the Netherlands for them to divest, for them to sell their oil and coal assets, as oil and gas assets. And the shareholders feel good. We got Shell to divest is the word they use, their oil and gas assets. But when you divest, somebody buys it. And when a responsible company like Shell, publicly traded company that has responsibility, sells its oil and gas assets, it's selling to a private company that has no public responsibility. Yeah. Those assets will still work, but they'll be less well managed. So think about what you're doing. Invest in companies through shareholding or through your purchasing decisions when it comes to commodities, such that you're sending a signal to those companies not to divest, but to invest in best practices.
Thank you. And I'm glad that we did get in the recycling and waste aspect. I'm on the science committee and I called for a federal inquiry into recycling and waste, and it's called From Rubbish to Resources, Enabling the Circular Economy. I'm very proud of that report, and we're trying to get some things like coin deposits facilities up locally as per the report. We've got a response from the government coming on that report, which is, I think, a very important report. It has initiated interest in the National Waste Plan, which we now have several $100 million being invested into actually developing our own recycling industry, because we've been shipping our waste overseas. The federal government has legislated so we can no longer ship most of our waste overseas, so glass, plastic, tyres, all those sorts of things can no longer be shipped, because as the Prime Minister has said, it is our waste, it's our responsibility. But I'm also a very big supporter of things like the national textile recycling industry. There's so much more we can do to make sure we upcycle, recycle, reuse, and we can think and live in a meaningful way, which is about thoughtfully about the way that we consume what we're doing. So as people say, there's emissions intensity, but there's also the way that we have energy intensity in the use of products that we are buying. So looking and being thoughtful about the products that we buy. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you. We've hit 7 o'clock, and thank you so much, Dr. Finkel, for what was a whistle-stop tour. I think we could probably talk for a few more hours. I hope we haven't geeked out everyone on the call, but I know people in Higgins are very passionate about these issues. And at the end of the day, we've all got to work together, governments, private industry, technology and consumers to make sure that we can work together to make the world a safer place. And that means driving down our emissions through all of these different sectors. I believe technology has solutions. I personally think there's still a few more solutions to come. When you've got $100 trillion of investment up in the pipeline, we know that there's going to be money coming down the stream. And I think there'll be an iPhone moment in some technology breakthroughs coming. That's just me. I'm probably a deluded optimist, but I hope for the world's sake that that is the case. But I really am very grateful for you giving us your time here today and for your ongoing service to our community with regards to your brilliance. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Katie, it was a real pleasure being interviewed by you because you have so many insights, and I think there'll be several iPhone moments.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Stay safe, stay well. Please email me any further questions. I have all of these questions here. They were all woven in. Sorry, they're a little bit woven in together, but I thought it made for a more interesting way to listen. But if you've got any further questions, we're happy to send them on to Dr. Finkel if we feel they're appropriate, or just send them in to me and we'll get the government to respond. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for your support over the years. I'm hoping to continue to be your representative in Higgins, and have a wonderful night tonight. Thank you so much.
Bye.